Welcome to Boston College Law School. Welcome to our third national conference for our initiative on land, housing, and property rights. It's cool for me personally to look out in the audience and see a lot of folks I know, some more recently, Solomon Green, for example. Some who I haven't seen in 22 or 23 years when I still had most of my hair. Whatever hair I had was black. And I'm thinking of Joe Childers from Kentucky. Last time we were hanging out, I was telling people it's not quite true that we were trespassing on the site of mountaintop removal, where they slice the top off of a mountain and mine coal. It's not really good for the environment. But I realized the security guard let us in, so that's technically not a trespass, although we didn't really represent who we were. And it's also cool to see a number of people in the room who I don't know, who I hope to meet over the course of the next day or two. As I indicated, this is our third national conference. The idea for this initiative, it was an idea of mine that I had done a number of things kind of in my career, the scholarship, some policy work, some student-facing stuff. A lot of the stuff I did was not considered part of my compensated job, my legal reform and policy work, for example, a lot of my student-facing stuff. But there was an award I won back in 2020 that created an opportunity to, do things in a different way, all right? And so my idea of leveraging that award was to build a center where we would do multiple things, and I would have staff that had expertise in a variety of different things. That would be kind of, that would just put us in the position of having a greater impact, right? And so with the initiative, as some of you have attended our conferences or interacted with us otherwise know, it's kind of built on 4 pillars. So the first thing is kind of the student-facing. Oftentimes law students are not exposed to property and housing issues that mostly impact disadvantaged communities that are disproportionately, but not exclusively, communities of color. And so one of the things to do that is to provide those students with greater guidance. So we created a curricular concentration in real estate and community development law. As an indication of, as I indicated, some of this stuff is a blast from the past. I did something similar when I was at the University of Wisconsin, where I was for 16 years. And one of my partners in crime was a leading law professor from the UW Business School's Real Estate and Urban Land Economic Department, which is top 2 or 3 in the country. Just so happens that that buddy of mine about 9 years ago retired and relocated from Madison to Newton, Massachusetts. And I was missing him so much, I just had to follow him. So Steve Malpezzi, raise your hand. So Steve and I worked on that concentration, and we made it more fully elaborated in here, added a community development piece. So that's one thing we do, is that now students who are interested in these issues have a lot more guidance on what kind of courses to take. Because a lot of the courses don't have the name real estate in them or housing them. If you're going to work in this space, you need to know something about tax. You need to know something about corporations. Sometimes you need to know stuff about securities. Sometimes you need to know something about environmental things. So, we launched that concentration in the fall of 2023, and it's already become quite popular with our students. In addition to the curricular stuff, we layer over some experiential learning. So we've created 4 or 5 externships, and then we've also created some internships, including most recently, and I know Destiny's here, with Harvard Law School's Veterans Clinic, which is the only clinic at Harvard Law School that does estate planning. Destiny runs an incredible operation, so I know some of her students are here who are not BC students, but we also have 2 BC students working at the Veterans Clinic at Harvard. So that's kind of like the student-facing stuff, but then I wanted to stand up a research team in terms of the legal reform work I do. It started with my research. The research was very grounded. It was based on a lot of field research, but it kind of exposed some property issues that weren't very well known, weren't very well elaborated. And as I've told a lot of folks, I didn't come to Boston College to create the initiative or the center on heirs property, because I see heirs property as a type of problem that had been understudied, underdeveloped, not sufficient enough touch, that is representative of a broader group of property and housing issues. And so I wanted to not just fetishize the thing I did, but to expand upon that, right? So I wanted to stand up a research team. But then I wanted, some of the research could just be for academics, and, we like to do our academic thing sometimes. But I also wanted a lot of that research to be policy relevant to inform that. So I wanted to stand up a policy team. And then the last thing is, because I first learned about heirs property from my field research when I was a grad student at Wisconsin, never would have known about it if I wasn't knocking around in various rural places in a number of southern states, and even then as meeting Joe in eastern Kentucky. And so I realized that there's probably a lot of other issues that would be better informed if we were in touch with communities, just for us to learn. And then for our policy shop to ground truth solutions we come up with. I kind of did that with my heirs property work, and I got feedback from the communities that was very useful. So that's the full complement: the student-facing, the research team, the policy team, and the community engagement team. So that was the idea. BC did provide me funding for 3 years where I could have 2 staff people. So Sam Gelly, our administrator, was our first employee in the September or October of 2022. And then David Price joined us. But we've had some expansion. And that expansion is largely attributable to some funding I got from J.P. Morgan Chase, and there's Abby Suarez, my good friend, and we're friends not just because you got the funding. We're like copacetic, we're in line. I genuinely say that, right? And then the other source of funding that's responsible for some of what you see here is the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and Ruth Gow. Where's Ruth? Hey, Ruth. Thank you, both of you. So what I wanted to do is just kind of introduce the staff so you guys can have a better idea of who we are. I mentioned Sam. David is the head of our special projects operation. And David came to us out of retirement. He's a lawyer who actually went to BC Law School. He practiced at the law firm in Massachusetts that has a reputation of having the best real estate department. So Goulston and Storrs, he did that for 3 or 4 years after graduating. But he mostly worked in community development thereafter. He was the executive director of 2 Boston-based community development corporations for, I think, in the aggregate 16 years or something like that. And then just saw this opportunity. And what was great is that before I came here, most of my work was national, almost nothing was Massachusetts. I did get a bill introduced in the Massachusetts legislature, but I was feeling like I can't really be here and be like all my work is elsewhere. And David's Rolodex of just housing and community development organizations is vast. And he kind of gave us instant credibility in Massachusetts, which is useful if you're going to live and work in Massachusetts. So that's David, the head of our special projects. And then I'm just going to go in the order that they're standing, and not necessarily the order they came on board. when I got this funding to do all this hiring this year, I knew that in addition, like I think the university places the postings on Indeed or something, or LinkedIn. I knew I had to do a lot more than that. So after I got the funding, I've done massive amounts of relentless prospecting. And one of my contacts, who's kind of like the guru of community land trusts in this country, is in Vermont. So we were talking, and he said, oh, you got to talk to this incredible real estate attorney in Boston. And so, you know, I was like, okay, well, let me just keep doing my networking. So David and I met for lunch, David Abramowitz. So David is, he was the first co-chair of Goulston and Storrs Real Estate Department or group. He's for many years on the executive committee of Goulston and Storrs. But David's done a ton of other things in terms of pro bono work, for a variety of leading Boston community development organizations. He had a stint at HUD. And so I thought I was meeting with David because I thought he might have some ideas for like a policy director. And somehow during the course he was like, kind of sounds interesting what you're doing. You think there might be any role for me? And I was like, oh, like really? So anyway, so David's our senior policy advisor. And he's already been very helpful in terms of ideas for additional kind of legal reform policy solutions. Okay, I'm doing that. That's why I hired him. Okay, I'm going to go quickly now because this is why. So Abby Ronkowski, okay, she's our operations and finance manager, but she's far more than that. Like she's basically the jack of all trades who makes everything kind of logistically happen and reduces the stress in my life by about 50%. And she comes from like working for LISC, working for NeighborWorks, so she's been great. Jill is our newest hire, just joined. Jill is our policy associate, which is our secondary policy position. She just graduated from Michigan State Law School. But before she went to Michigan State, she had a long career in doing nonprofit management. She has a degree, master's in that as well. And so just incredibly entrepreneurial law student who reached out to me a couple of years ago and has done great. Jessica just finished her first year of law school here. She's our policy intern. And so welcome, Jessica. Leanne we have a project funded by Harvard, the Harvard and Legacy of Slavery Initiative, where we're using estate planning as a home preservation. And so Leanne came from Suffolk Law School, and the fellowship is 2 years, and she's doing amazing work that you'll hear about later. Megan Haberly is our policy director. She came from in DC. She worked for a variety of organizations, doing a lot of kind of housing policy in a variety of contexts. So I think it was 12 years in DC. One of our also most recent hires is Michael Neal as our research director. I can hardly believe that Michael, I shouldn't say the statement against interest, expressed interest in the job, actually applied, and then after we offered him the job, actually accepted. So he just joined this week. Michael has his arrangement is he comes from the Urban Institute. He's half-time for us, and he's still in DC working for the Urban Institute, which I think will create opportunities for partnership with us, which I'm really excited about. And you guys have met Sam. Okay, so I hired Abby to tell me when to get off stage. She's telling me I should have ended 3 minutes ago. So I'm going to just turn this over and welcome you guys again.
So I'm probably the only artist in the room today. My name is Rachel Loischild, and I have been working on this Heirs property project for a few years. I'm primarily a photographer, but I also have expanded my practice to some other mediums, so we'll see a little bit of that at the end. So I call this project Heirs Property, a photographic exploration, a history of Black home ownership and land loss, and is generally, broadly speaking, looking at the economic violence of white supremacy. And I was trying to figure out what ultimately is this project about. That was part of the core mission that a lot of people don't like to say out loud, and I find that it's sometimes the artist's job to say that part out loud. So, here we go. All right. I first heard about Heirs property because of Thomas. It was on a Planet Money podcast, and it was in the summer of 2022 that I heard the podcast. I'm not sure when you recorded it, but that's when I heard it. And I had never heard of Heirs property. And hearing the story of the Loud family, this was Jacob Loud. He was a formerly enslaved person that was able to get, I have the little details there, 160 acres in northwest Louisiana. Is there a way to not have that stuff pop up? From a land grant. And he got it in 1906. All right. Fast forward 100 years, and 4% of his descendants' land was sold to basically white assholes. I mean, really cutting to the chase, right? Ultimately, it was that 4% was transferred a few times, and it was transferred to a timber developer. He bought that 4% for $1,000, right? That timber developer forced a partition sale. The goal, obviously, of a timber developer is to cut down timber, right? That part is very clear. They do not care how many people had lived on that land. They do not care how many people care about that land, right? They don't care about the memories you have on that land, and they don't actually care about the economic stability of the generations of people that deserve to stay on that land and wanted to stay on that land. It took me a few years to get down there. I did eventually make it to Castor. I'll show some more pictures later, but this is one from that area, from the previously loaned, the lost land, right? So basically, this one podcast, I get a lot of my ideas from podcasts. That podcast, it had a big impression on me, and I could see when the family member on the podcast was describing how they existed on this land, and they went fishing, and they farmed, and they just communed with nature and their family, and that their family lived there for 100 years. I was really angry. I was really angry, and I was trying to figure out how is this a project? What is this? Like, if something's making me that angry, I need to make some work about it, because as an artist, that's what I do. And so I didn't know for a little while what to do. I could envision some pictures from them describing this land, and I didn't know what to do. And then, it's not Phil. And then I started doing a little bit of research, and I found, I'm just going to keep going, and the slides will catch you. I found a research paper that Dr. Mitchell was a part of, but not the primary author. Dr. Francis was the primary author on it, and turns out she was at UMass Boston, and ultimately she was presenting at that first year's conference, and it was actually, she didn't respond to my first email, I'll admit that. It was, Bryce Ducky, who responded to that first email. I just emailed like everybody that was on that paper that was just like, I'm curious about this, and anyone want to talk about this with me? I don't understand how to find out about this. And he emailed me back and was like, I can't really teach you about this, but there's this conference in a little while, you should just come. I was like, okay, cool, where is it? He was like, it's in Boston. I was like, amazing, I live in Boston. This works out really, really well. And so at that first conference, and through the paper, I was honed into just Heirs property. That's what I cared about, right? I was like, I just want to learn about Heirs property. But that first year was a much broader focus, right? And I did not appreciate the scope of the bigger problem that Heirs property is obviously, I'm going to say a symptom of, a part of, and that is the black land loss of 90% since 1910, right? Estimated at over 360 billion. I think that's a low estimate, but you know, money is a construct entity, so it's a lot. At that conference, I learned about many paths to land dispossession, right? There's eminent domain, which I kind of knew about, but then the USDA discriminations, physical violence, obviously like literal violence where people are forced off their land, and then, oh, all of a sudden that land doesn't belong to you anymore. How does that work, right? And then obviously heirs property vulnerabilities, partition sales, and tax sales, you know, and all the things that stem from it. There we go. So in the first year, I had a lot of trouble actually finding how to locate heirs property to photograph. It's everywhere and completely invisible, and if you're not a lawyer or working with community groups dealing with it as a very layman, I did not know how to do that. And so I decided, you know what? After going to that first conference, I was like, okay, Black land loss, let's start big and go in. And so that first year, I was already going to Florida for a different project, doing different things. I ended up in Tampa, where there's a massive, I mean, every city has eminent domain that destroys Black neighborhoods, but Tampa in particular had the gas plant neighborhood, which they built Interstate 75, and also the where they played baseball, Tropicana Field. And so I went and I started by photographing that, because if you're ever working on a project, the important part, at least to me, is you just gotta get started, right? So I started where I could find the material. And then I went to Rosewood, Florida, which I'm sure many of you had heard of. I will admit, I had not until I started this research. I didn't know about it. So it was a small but thriving town of 200 Black residents. It's in kind of northwest Florida. And in 1923, a white mob descended on the town and destroyed every single home and attempted to murder every single Black person they could find. This was over several days. Many people escaped, many people did not. No home survived in the town. They burned every single home to the ground. So the survivors fled to the swamps and the surrounding areas. Having visited the town, I can say with 99% confidence, I did not see a single Black family around. I only saw white property owners in this little town at this point. And a lot of no trespassing signs. So I have a few, that tiny little red dot on the back is a no trespassing sign. I just found it very interesting, the amount of no trespassing signs for a town that did not actually belong to any of these people. If we really went down legally, how did they get title to this land? I want to know, right? But that's another question. So I'm just going to show you a few pictures from this beginning of the project. So kind of envisioning where people, the button's not buttoning. Oh, here we go. Okay. Thank you. Sorry. Part of this research that I did for going to Rosewood was I read The Rosewood Massacre, An Archaeology and History of Intersectional Violence by Edward Gonzalez-Tennant. And he obviously indicates everything was destroyed. But the most fascinating part for me in trying to figure out this place and how to learn about a place that everything's been destroyed was he indicated that the best way to find where the homes were if you find old magnolia trees. If you find magnolia trees that are over 100 years old, that's where the houses were. Because people planted them. They were a domesticated plant that people planted on their home, like around their homes. And I happened upon this one site that had just happened to be cleared out, like a new home was going to be built, and it was surrounded by old growth magnolia. And I was like, holy shit, I found it, I did it. I went down not knowing what, like I show up at a place and I don't know what I'm gonna find. And I found this plot that had been surrounded by old growth magnolias. And they happened to be burning brush in the background. So, right, as an artist, I really like when the history and the fact that all of the homes were burned down kind of overlap with some visual resonance. And of course I had no trespassing signs, because of course it did. But since there wasn't a home there, I felt emboldened in this case to just go for it. I love this one. So this on the right was the biggest magnolia tree. I was obsessed with that tree. I don't think he's here. There was a PhD student that I talked to at last year's conference, and I was showing him some, so I shot this before last year's conference, and I was showing him some of the pictures, and we started talking. He was like, right, memory trees. It's a thing. These trees that witness these events, and the trees persist, right? When nothing else persists, it's these trees that lived through it. All right, so I get obsessed with these magnolia trees and these sites, and that was Rosewood, Florida. It just keeps not buttoning. All right, here we go. Is there a trick to it? All right. You just this happens a lot. All right. So next, after the second year in conference, I decide, okay, yes, I wanted to expand it to these other reasons for land dispossession, but really, I want to go to northern Louisiana. I want to see the land of that. I want to see Castor, and I want to see this Heirs property that I saw in my head. I want to know. And so we had the picture earlier from Castor. I did not have a personal contact for that particular property, so my photographic journey in Castor was short-lived due to the scary nature of, I'm going to just go with southern white people with no trespassing signs. So I did take some pictures there, but it was not as extensive. But I also was able to, through researching the area and trying to figure out, all right, is there other publicly understood Heirs property generally in that region? And there was. I watched the Vice News documentary Losing Ground about the Lewis family, and I ended up, so it was about an hour south of Castor, and so I stayed right in between the two and visited both locations, and I happened to just try and go and see the land that was lost for the Lewis family. The Lewis family had 480 acres, they owned it for over 100 years, kind of same story, but this one was even more nefarious. This timber developer truly targeted them for a decade, just trying to steal their land, and was able to purchase it for about $1,000 an acre. Many generations of the Lewis family was still living on this land at the time, and of the many people that co-owned this 480 acres, everyone received just a couple $1,000. Going there, I was able to meet Michael, just by chance, who is one of the descendants. He had to move his trailer home off of the ancestral land, down the road, and it took his entire $2,500 to move his mobile home. He was not able to pay to get running water installed. This man is moving water from a bucket down the street when he needs water, right? And so this is where I've already kind of entered the theme of the tree to kind of go through, and this is where I want to enter the theme of water kind of going through in terms of Heirs property, because it's both, in this case, it's literal potable water. In a minute we're going to see in a few other ways that I'm sure all of you know about, but that I learned firsthand from hanging out with Michael for a day and hearing about his life. And he was so generous with his time and wanted to show me, he couldn't show me obviously all 400 acres, but the parts that were still accessible to us from the road, he took me around for the day to show me and tell me all of his family stories about who lived where, what aunt and uncle grew what where, and we went, continue? You just need to hang out with me. It's gonna work. There we go. All right. Just literally get a chair. Oh, try that one. Okay. All right. So this was one of the Lewis family ancestral homes that he brought me to. It was very handy to have him with me, in part because one of his cousins has basically, I will admit I'm not understanding the legal aspects. One of his cousins has refused to move off the land, which God bless it. But he has some scary dogs that keep most other people off. And so if I didn't have Michael with me, I would not be safely on this property. But because Michael and I were journeying together, he spoke very firmly to those dogs, and I was unaccosted, right? And so he showed me the houses that were still standing, as well as the steps that used to lead to his home, right? That's where his home used to be. And where his family lived, it was this, okay, we're just going. All right. I am not seeing it. I'm going to go really fast now. My apologies. All right. I've also shot on his property where the timber company has clear cut, right? So this kind of is the through line with the trees. The trees that had been there for the 100 years are all now cut down. So we kind of see the environmental degradation. Keep going. All right. We're going to fast forward. I'm skipping so much, and I do want to talk to all of you. If you want to hear any more about any of it, we're just going to go so fast because I have so much. I am ill-timed this. All right. I had the opportunity to work with LISC Jacksonville, and part of that opportunity, they encouraged me to also shoot in Miami. And so in Miami, it was a mix of me, I worked in Jacksonville first, but we'll see those pictures in a second. It was both, this is a photo that demonstrates eminent domain of the highway going through a previously black neighborhood of Overtown. This was a previously black home in front of a very gentrified and overbuilt up Miami. And you can see the mango tree in the backyard. Like someone clearly planted that on purpose. I also started to figure out, I was like, all right, in Miami I didn't have any personal contacts as such. That was really hard. But figuring out neighborhoods, like reverse engineering segregated neighborhoods that used to be 100% black owned. I could go into the neighborhood, and then at this point I had already gone to Jacksonville. I understood what Heirs property looked like, and I understand if a home is no longer owned by a black family, that is now black land loss. So I can understand both things at the same time. And this is a home that I identified for its roof decay and also seeing multi-generations living in this home and the state of the home as an Heirs property. This was in Richmond Heights. I'm not going to get into the details because we have no time. All right, we're going to keep going. Richmond Heights, an abandoned house, Liberty City. I wish I had a liaison for Liberty City. Members of the community advised me not to walk through this neighborhood by myself with my camera. So I didn't make as many pictures as I would have liked to had I been with a member of the community, as the members in the community did not feel it was safe for me. So I took that under advisement. We're in Miami Gardens, another previously segregated neighborhood. This, the color version of this is a blue tarp, but I just like the lines of it in black and white. All right, we're in Jacksonville, Florida. I meant to get here a lot faster. I'm looking at John, I'm looking at Chris. This part should have been much more of the story. My apologies, time went very fast. All right, so getting to work with LISC was incredible. In part because, well, they're incredible people, and I think everyone in this room knows about LISC and probably knows about LISC Jacksonville because they're awesome. But they very generously funded this part of the project and connected me with Heirs property owners and neighborhoods that were really had a lot of Heirs property. This was Henry. I hung out with him for an afternoon, well, a couple afternoons. He was awesome. I will admit, I'm not convinced he has potable water. He's also very concerned, there's a river in front of his home. He's very concerned about how the city has changed the geography, and he's worried about flooding for his home at this point as well. But LISC has helped Henry get his title and get his property out of Heirs property status. We have the east side, which is an area that has a lot of Heirs property. This is a vacant lot with a house behind it that I presume to have Heirs property based on the state of the roof. This is Natavia. I got to hang out with her and her family, and which was just wonderful. And there's a lot of details I will not get into at this moment, but their family history is incredibly important. And I believe the slides will be available later for anyone that wants to read the details. This is the actual photograph of her family home that she lives with 4 generations in this home. And then there's other properties. She took me around the whole neighborhood, which was just amazing. Here is some more from Jacksonville. Other homes that either were identified for me or that I identified as Heirs property. My hope, this one I just have to tell this story. Okay, so I'm walking around this neighborhood, and I didn't give you the context. I'm using a large format camera, so the kind that you throw a sheet over your head, like an old school large format camera. I am obviously a white lady that sticks out like a sore thumb in a lot of these neighborhoods. Some people think I'm a surveyor. Some people are just like, what is happening here, right? And this young man comes out of this home and asks me what I'm doing. And so I explain that I'm working with LISC and I'm trying to help, and I'm documenting Heirs properties. And he was like, oh, we have estate properties. Is that the same? I said, yes, it is the same. And he talks to me about how his ancestors built this home, built this roof, but now over 100 years later, this tin roof no longer keeps the water out. And he was really lamenting about that. But ultimately the conversation I go to, like, that's incredible that this house that your ancestors built 100 years ago, that this roof has lasted 100 years, is incredible. And like, that's actually an incredible legacy, right? And it's a bummer that we don't have the money right now to like fix it, but we should still like honor that history. And anyway, getting to talk to him was just incredible. And also, he didn't know the song, like, if I were a rich man, I'd have a tin roof, and so we talked about that a little bit, which so that's where my head goes. Yes, I will get there, promise. But Liz is going to get to see all the pictures, so. So a few more from Jacksonville. There used to be a home here, and then the trees are now coming over the empty lot. It's also a problem that developers are coming in and taking up this property that used to be black owned, right? And are going to charge exorbitant rents that no one in the neighborhood can afford. I don't know if you can see the detail here. There's a homemade quilt with teeny tiny quilt patterns used to block that window, and I just love the history in the residence that shows how long someone has been there and the family history implied in that. And also that these neighborhoods are built next to big industry, and kind of the implications of pollution on these communities is enormous. I love the scale of this tree just overpowering this house. There's no way this tree was this big when this house was built, right? And again, the roof really indicating that it's needing a little love, but someone was capable of painting this house themselves, and they care so much, they're trying. All right, this is it's a property that's not lived in right now. But I love that we still have these markers that a family was there. Someone cared about this home enough to plant those flowers in the front, right? So that the history is persisting, and the love that someone had for this home persists even after whatever terrible circumstance led to them not being able to live there anymore. All right, another abandoned. Love the light on that one. All right, we're gonna keep going. This is an abandoned lot next to 2 Heirs properties. All right, and thank you. This project has been made possible by an American Aftermath grant and Bliss Jacksonville, where I did an artist residency. And finally, I want to partner with all of you. So I need research partners, I need funding partners, I would love neighborhood ambassadors, I would love to talk to Heirs property families, and then for some of the lawyers out there or people doing your own research, I would love to get my hands on more of the ads for sheriff sales and partition sales, as well as some legal documents. I want to make a piece kind of about how dense these legal documents are for regular people to read and try and experience. And so I can explain that later if you want to partake in that. And then if you want to contact me, this is me, and answer questions. And this video is a piece based on W.E.B. Du Bois' data portraits, data visualizations that he presented at the World's Fair. I am turning them into what I call light sculptures and projecting. So I've digitally manipulated the data, and then I'm projecting it onto fog. What you would hear if you were experiencing the sculpture is the sound of dripping water, so it has that through line of the water. It's also meant to communicate kind of how all of the data that, and many of you are researchers, all of this data is actually all around us all the time, and actually really hard for most people to read or understand. And so when it is in person, this is just a video of the sculpture, but when you're in it, you're walking through this mist, you're walking through these projections, and the projections land on the fog that I've made out of water. So I made my own fog machine, because I'm crazy. Okay, I'm only a little bit over time, but I'm just following Dr. Mitchell's I definitely left out a lot. Yes?
Maybe 2 questions. I am curious about what's your end goal, and like, and maybe you are. Hi. I am curious about what is the end goal. I know you partner with organizations that do work with Heirs property owners, but from an artistic perspective, what do you hope to achieve by documenting? And then the other question, I'm a death and drug attorney, and when I had my law practice, most of my clients allowed me to come visit them at their property, which for me as a lawyer helped me step into my human self more, because I could see their homes, I see grandma's little trinkets, I could relate to it in a very human way. And if without knowing what your project is about, looking at your images, they're images of things that we see everywhere. They're not specific to any type of social justice issue. So I'm curious also, how do you hope users will experience those images, particularly because they are in 1D or 2D?
Right. And the projection is more 3D that you can't see at the moment. But My hope, number one, is raise awareness, right? It's like heirs property and black land loss generally is something that many many people in power have no idea is happening. And so by just having this as a project outside of these very specific academic spheres or communities that are directly affected in a way that they know, it's like if you're experiencing it, you know about it. But if you're not experiencing it, you don't know about it. And so I think trying to make work that speaks to bigger issues, and I mean, I hear you that maybe my imagery is not, maybe it's not working, right? If we don't know, that is always no. But I think it's valid. Like, what is if someone just sees a picture and they don't have any words to go with it, is it working? My hope eventually, as I continue, I see myself as just starting this project. I want to shoot a lot more. That it will communicate both the inherent value, not just monetary value, but the inherent value of these homes, because I think, and humanize, kind of as you were saying, and that these homes are important, and it's not just eking out every penny from, the potential of this home is what's important. It's actually the home itself, and the people are actually really important. What I didn't get into is a balancing act as an artist to include what people to include in the pictures, what people not to include in the pictures. I don't want to further disenfranchise any marginalized people by exploiting them in my photography, right? And so balancing what to share, what not to share, what might be too personal. Many people invited me into their homes, but inside felt, I think, too personal and felt like overstepping for the project. But maybe at some point it might make more sense, I'm not sure. And sometimes the outside looks okay. One family that I visited in Jacksonville, the outside actually looks fine, but inside you realize they don't have a working kitchen. Like, inside is poverty. And so it's kind of this balancing act of like, even though these homes are impoverished, they are still valuable, but maybe not in the traditional economic sense. And also what has been stolen. Like, so it's, I don't know.
Yeah,
I'm also still figuring it out.
You also have to balance I mean, I know you are contextualizing this within the Black community, but it's also a balance that you have to strike as an artist to avoid othering.
Absolutely.
Or, I think many of us who work in the heirs property movement actually want everybody to understand that home ownership and having a roof that doesn't leak and having potable water is very
yes,
we all need it. So
everyone
it's not
needs it. Exactly.
This isn't a poverty point issue. I admire what you're doing, and I think, I hope that people do partner with you to infuse it with even more context so that it does reach your goals.
Yeah. I think we can take one more question. Oh, there we go. So this is the it's a little bit jaggy, but this is the video of these projections into fog, and you kind of experience the data in a 3D way.
Hi, my name is Ursula Henderson. I'm coming here from Austin, Texas, and so I work in the housing department.
Yeah.
So surprisingly, part of what I do, I put out solicitations for community organizations to do projects, and so happily, I did receive some money, and I'm in the process. Reason why I'm here, I'm getting ready to put out a solicitation for Heirs property because I have seen in my community where a lot of Black and brown folks have lost their homes, and so kind of started out small. One of the projects that do full-fledged estate planning to try to clear titles, things with families. It was by surprise that we got this project, right? And so now we want to distribute it out to everyone in the community, specifically those that are low income. But so that I can, I want to make sure that I know that I probably won't cover all of the bases. And one thing that I kind of know just from the past and just listening to you briefly here, part of the heirs property is repairs plays a big part in it too. So I'm getting that. And so just speaking with you and from your visits, what other components do you think that is useful for an organization to be able, to help families with, to I'm not gonna say for successful, but, you know, to get them to clear out the heirs property to keep them from losing it. One thing that I did notice is that when it's multiple family members, and I know that I encourage them to have community groups, right? Because sometimes you have that one person that doesn't agree, and it's hard to get a clear title.
Yeah.
But what other components that will be useful for me that when I submit my solicitation, you know, to make sure that I'm kind of covering my grounds so that I can have a full circle program to, you know, to avoid them losing their property.
So that might be a bigger question than I feel equipped to fully answer. I mean, my bottom line is people need money, and they need help, like legal help. But I'm not sure.
That's one of the components, legal assistance.
It's legal assistance and funds to do the localized repairs, because it can, yeah, and literally just money just to pay to my understanding is just to do the paperwork for the title itself. Like sometimes that's the barrier.
Yes.
Yeah, but it's a little bit beyond. I want to speak about these issues, but I should have practiced this with. I'm not actually a lawyer, even though I play one on TV.
She's a photographer. Okay,
I'm the photographer. Sorry.
I'm so sorry.
I'm the artist.
I came in just, I had a late flight and I came in just.
No, it's okay. I appreciate that you felt I was equipped to answer that. I love it. So I am just trying to represent these ideas and this value to the broader community at large, beyond people that already kind of know about it. So.
Well, you took great pictures.
Thank you. That's my hope. And so I hope to get to collaborate with many of you. And I'm being told to stop, but I'd love to talk with all of you, and to whatever extent we can collaborate in whatever ways. Wait, I realized I didn't answer one final question. I would love to have a book collaboration at some point, and it can be as narrow or as broad. I would love to have exhibitions. I want to get this work into the public in whatever way we can figure out, and mostly in ways that that require collaboration. So, thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Abby Suarez, and I lead the Housing Policy and Philanthropy work at JPMorgan Chase. And I am so thrilled to be here today. And as a houser coming to learn about Heirs property, I am so honored and excited to moderate a housing conversation that's going to dive into the intersection of housing affordability issues, housing stability issues, wealth building, and heirs property. I think I should say that JPMorgan Chase is dedicated to helping ensure that all homeowners can fully enjoy the benefits of homeownership, which is why we got into this issue, and we've been working at the intersection of wealth building and heirs property. We're trying to leverage our philanthropic capital, our business, and our policy expertise to tackle heirs property challenges. And we are especially grateful for the partnership with Professor Mitchell and the Initiative on Land, Housing, and Property Rights. We're so thrilled to be here. So today, I have the pleasure of introducing very esteemed panelists, and they have very long bios, so I'm going to do the best I can to get to the gist of it. And so first, I have the pleasure of introducing Alexander Kernan, a Senior Research Associate at the Joint Center of Housing Studies of Harvard University. He's working on projects related to housing markets, affordability, and housing policy. Alex has been a researcher at the center for nearly a decade and has helped lead the center's flagship annual report, The State of the Nation's Housing, since 2017. And as a houser, it is an incredible report that informs all of our work, so I'm very excited that that he's here today. Before joining the center, he worked as a grant writer at the Detroit nonprofit, providing housing and treatment services to homeless populations. He received a master's in public policy and urban planning for University of Michigan. So Alex, you want to come up?
Thank you, Abby. Thank you, everyone, for having me. It's an honor and a privilege to be here. I am, as you just heard, Alex Herman. I'm a researcher at the Joint Center for Housing Studies. I'm here to present, let's hope I have some better luck. Great. So far, so good. Here to present some findings from our forthcoming flagship report, The State of the Nation's Housing 2025. We actually released this report in a week and a half on Tuesday, June 24th, both virtually and here live in Boston for the first time since before the pandemic at the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. So hope to see some local folks there. Given the nature of this conference, I'll be focusing on homeownership, the home buying market, homeowner affordability challenges, but the report itself, of course, covers a much broader set of factors happening in the housing market overall. The three key themes I'm going to touch on here today focus on the for sale market. The pandemic reset the housing market in some very fundamental and important ways, and we're living through that and with that still right now. Most importantly, the market itself has caused prices and housing costs to rise considerably, and that's priced out a large number of potential home buyers and also increasingly burdened a number of existing homeowners. I'm going to start with the for sale market specifically and home prices in particular. So home prices continue to rise modestly even into early this year, despite the fact that interest rates remain high and affordability challenges have weakened demand considerably. Home prices, which are represented by that red-orange area there, continue to chug along at a 3.9% clip in February. That's a lot lower than a year ago and considerably lower than the 20% all-time high annual price growth we were seeing in 2021, 2022. But still pushing up home prices cumulatively, that's a tough word to say, about 60% since 2019 and more than 127% since 2010. The primary driver of continued home price growth has been the limited supply of housing available for sale. And here we can see the amount of housing inventory available for sale in March of each year, going back to 2003. On the left axis, those green or blue bars there represent the number of homes available for sale. And at the end of March, just a couple of months ago, there were 1.3 million homes available for sale. That's significantly lower, about 20% lower than the 1.7 million homes that were available back in 2019. And 2019 was already a market that was pretty constrained. Importantly, though, at the same time, inventories are rising now a little bit more considerably. So while we're still constrained, inventories are up 20% from a year ago, and they're up about 40% from the bottom, I think, in 2022 there. And if you look at the months of supply, which takes the inventory and tells you how long, that's the orange line there, how long it takes all these homes to sell, that's at about 4 months of supply and up just above pre-pandemic era levels. Inventory kind of remains important. It's what we're looking at for how these trends are going to be changing. But right now, we're still in this really constrained market. The combination of high prices and low inventories has effectively frozen the home buying market. So this is just existing home sales going back to 1994 annually. In 2021, there were over 6 million existing homes sold. If you fast forward to 2024, there were 4 million, just over 4 million homes sold. That's the lowest levels in 3 decades. But prices were rising rapidly, and inventory was even more constrained if you go back to 2021. So what's been different the past 2 years? What's really slowed the home buying market down? It's interest rates, right? Higher mortgage rates have made the home buying market impossible for a growing number of households, effectively pricing out many home buyers. And I think that's what this table shows you here. So interest rates at a 30-year fixed rate mortgage averaged just under 3% in 2021. In 2024, mortgage rates averaged 6.7%. That stayed that high, and even a little bit higher through most of early this year. Over that same time period, the median sales price rose about $55,000 up to $412,000. That means the monthly payments on a median price home, making very modest assumptions for a down payment at about 3.5%, 3% closing costs, a little bit of money for taxes and insurance. The costs on that median price home were $3,270 last year, and that's a $1,200 increase in just the last 3 years. If you assume, I know there's a lot of numbers I'm throwing at you, but if you assume a 31% debt-to-income ratio, what is the income a household would need to afford those payments? That's increased nearly $50,000 up to $127,000, right? So that, the number of renter households, only 1 out of every 8 renter households can afford that payment, compared to 2021 when 1 out of every 3 renter households could afford that payment. And this doesn't include down payment assistance. It doesn't include any kind of upfront costs, which are an even bigger barrier for many home buyers. But if you think about why the home buying market is where it is right now, it's due to these affordability challenges. If you look at this historically, so this is just tracking that monthly mortgage payment over time, and that's the middle line, that orange line there. We've hovered near record highs since about middle of 2023. So in inflation-adjusted terms, monthly payments are about 40% higher today than they were in 1990. And one result of that, obviously, is that the homeownership rate declined for the first time last year in about 8 years, since 2016. So homeowner household growth slowed considerably, about halved from 2023 to 2024, pushing down the homeownership rate to about 65.5%. Declining homeownership opportunities have stalled recent progress in closing racial homeownership gaps. Here I show you the homeownership rate for white households, for black households, and for Hispanic households in 1994 and in 2024. If you take this longer view, we've seen a lot of movement, obviously, between these 2 time periods, but if you take this longer 30-year look, little to no progress has been made in closing racial homeownership gaps. So the racial homeownership gap between white and black households was about 28 percentage points in 2024. It was a little lower even 30 years ago in 1994. Over that same period, the racial homeownership gap between white and Hispanic households has closed a little bit, from about 27.5 percentage points to about 25 percentage points. Importantly, given the home buyer affordability challenges I already talked about, you'll see no real progress in reducing these gaps as long as our housing market challenges continue to persist. Growing costs aren't just a challenge for those folks who are trying to enter homeownership, but it's also a challenge for many existing homeowners. And I think rising insurance premiums are the most notable example of that. The growing cost and frequency of climate-related disasters has increased considerably in recent decades, and you saw record highs for both last year. And that's prompted a lot of insurers to pull out of markets entirely in some cases, to reduce their coverage, and then even for those who are able to get insurance still, insurance premiums have risen. So between 2018 and 2024, the period you see here, the average insurance premiums have risen 62%, up to about $1,800, or just under $1,800, according to the data we have from Freddie Mac. These rising homeownership costs, not just insurance, but mortgage costs in some cases, but also property taxes, have increased the number of homeowners with cost burdens considerably over the last 4 or 5 years. Cost burden households are those who spend more than 30% of their income on housing. As of 2023, the most recent data we have, a quarter of all homeowners, or about 20.3 million homeowners overall, and that's the left bar, that bluish bar, were cost burdened. And that's an increase of about 3.6 million, just under 4 million homeowners with cost burden since 2019. I don't say much about renter affordability, but I do think it's worth pointing out that the number of renters with cost burdens has also increased considerably, and is at record highs of about 22.6 million. For homeowners, though, most of the growth in cost burdens has come among lower income households. So nearly 3/4 of owners earning under $30,000 had cost burdens. That's up about 5.5 percentage points since 2019, twice the rate of the homeownership rate burden overall. And much of this increase is due to the growing number of older adult homeowners many of whom live on a fixed income, many of whom are going to struggle to afford much needed repairs on their homes. It's a very important, it's a very challenging housing market right now, but I think it's important to take the doom and gloom and end on a somewhat more positive point. The kind of flip side to the rising home price increases that we've seen is a record high, homeowners have record high equity in their homes, even as mortgage debt has stayed relatively constant. So at the end of last year, aggregate home equity totaled just under $35 trillion. And of course, not all share in this wealth equally, but that comes out to about $400,000 per homeowner household across the country. And then most existing homeowners have a lower rate, of course, than the outstanding kind of current mortgage rate, right? Because of home purchases or refinancing in 2020 and 2021, about 3/4 of all homeowners with a mortgage have a rate below 5%, and nearly half have a rate below 3.5%. So that's all for me. Thank you so much for your time. Looking forward to your questions.
Great. I will now invite the rest of the panelists to come up. I just want to say thank you so much for the preview, Alex. And us households call this the locked in and locked out effect. So homeowners are locked in their homes because of the interest rate environment, the nature of the interest rate environment, and renters are locked out of homeownership opportunities. And you can see the wealth building opportunities in terms of the equity pieces that we want to protect. So I hope you see a lot of the intersectionalities between housing, housing affordability, homeownership, and heirs property. Okay, so I will now like to introduce Simone Crawford, who is the Executive Director of the Massachusetts Affordable Homeownership Alliance, MAHA. Simone began her inspiring journey with MAHA in 2004 as a volunteer, driven by a passion for increasing homeownership opportunities for people of color and first-time homebuyers. Born in Jamaica, Simone moved to Boston in 1999 and became a homeowner in the Mattapan, did I get that right? Through a mortgage program negotiated by MAHA, and this personal experience sparked her advocacy for affordable housing and community empowerment. Before she assumed her current leadership role, she served on the MAHA's board for 11 years. So, Simone, please discuss the pattern within the housing system that you've observed through your work leading MAHA. Tell us more about MAHA groundbreaking work directly serving first-generation and first-time homebuyers, as well as the organizing and power-building efforts that successfully sought to increase resources for homeownership. We also want you to tell us a little bit about what barriers you witness, especially when we're talking about intergenerational access to homeownership.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for that question. MAHA's work, first I want to ask you to give me grace as I use my notes, because I have so much in my head to share and I want to keep on point, okay? So the work that we do at MAHA really centers on understanding that ownership barriers require both immediate hands-on support for families and long-term systemic change. We can't just help one family at a time without fighting for policies that help our entire community. So I want to walk you through how we approach both sides of this work and what we're doing on the ground. We offer direct services to our community. That means we do pre- and post-purchase classes at MAHA. We offer a first-time curriculum that brings in our subject matter experts, our realtors, our attorneys, inspectors, and insurance personnel to fully integrate our clientele and on the process of purchasing a home. That's the first-time home buying piece. We also do post-purchase homeownership education and foreclosure prevention work, where we help potential landlords or condo owners or single-family owners understand what they're getting into, how to get the home, and to keep that home. In addition, we do a lot of organizing work, grassroots organizing. The senator is right here with me and has been a great partner in most of these policy initiatives that we enter into around homeownership opportunities for low and moderate income individuals. We have our Home Buyers Union members. These are individuals that have gone through our first-time home buyer classes and then have the opportunity, like myself, to advocate for the solutions that impact the community that we are trying to serve. That means we bring our Home Buyers Union members to the table through grassroots organizing to impact change around all policies relating to homeownership, some policies around rental, and even some jobs training. We also have our STASH program, which is our down payment and closing cost assistance program for first generation home buyer. These are individuals that do not have the bank of mom and dad. It means that not only are these individuals, including myself, even though I did not have the opportunity to access STASH because it was not around at the time I purchased my home, these individuals working 2 and 3 jobs can't afford to save because the rents are really, really high. And so having a down payment and closing cost assistance program like STASH for those that have systemic barriers that their parents never owned and they had no idea or have been told over generations that they can't own a home. But coming through MAHA classes and then entering into this first gen program made possible through Boston Children's Hospital Determinant of Health Grant, we're able to get quite a few of our individuals into the home ownership realm. In addition, I would just like to share a story. One is myself. In 1998, my husband, my 3 daughters, and myself was living in a basement apartment. Less than desirable, but that's what we could afford at the time. And one of the things that was is still memorable to us is the fact that my husband at 6'2" could not stand up straight in that apartment. There were other plumbing issues and things that was just not conducive for healthy family living, but that's what we could afford, that's what a family member could do for us, and we were very appreciative. I was introduced to MAHA at the time when I took the first time home buyer class, and then was introduced to the Home Buyers Union member. And I started advocating, meeting individuals, much like the governor, like the senator, and mayors, and other lending institution CEOs to help to impact change around homeownership opportunities. Fast forward to 14 years later, I am sitting in this seat as the executive director because of the were open. Thank you. Now, it's important that I share that story because the individuals that I meet along the way coming through our classes want to see individuals that have the lived experiences, that understand that if I can do this as an immigrant, then so can they, whether you're an immigrant or not. The sad thing, though, is we have many barriers. We can see that our home ownership and wealth gap in the state of Massachusetts is one of the worst in the country. That is because we do not have a lot of inventory around to help with the market that we have today. I am commending the state of Massachusetts, the governor's office, HLC, senators, and the other legislators for the amazing bond bill that was passed. There's a lot of policy in there, including the community. I lost it, I forgot the name of the act, but it's the Transit Act that allows building near transit. All of this is to help to open up opportunities for homes to be built for low-moderate income individuals across our state. But we need funding. And so as much as we have a lot of policy to help with this, we need funding. So also we understand that some of the barriers include credit, include lack of understanding of the process that it takes to get through homeownership opportunities, and so many more that MAHA is prepared to and has been helping others to navigate. And so I'll pause here, and hopefully we can get into more details later. Thank you.
Thank you, Simone. Now I would like to introduce Salma Green, who leads the Lincoln Land
The Lincoln Institute for Land Policy's Land and Communities Impact Area, which conducts research, builds networks, supports and scales innovation, and strengthens the capacity of local leaders across the globe to expand access to safe, stable, and affordable housing. Before joining the Lincoln Institute, Solomon was appointed by President Biden to lead the HUD's Office of Policy Development and Research. Before joining HUD, he held varied leadership positions in research institutions, affordable housing, and community development organizations, as well as local government, philanthropy. He has an extensive publishing history, and I would encourage you guys to look up all the things that Solomon has written. So tell me, Solomon, in your senior leadership roles at the intersection of research and policy, they've provided you with a broad perspective on the dynamics of the housing field, including insights to tensions that may be at play as policymakers, advocates, and practitioners consider the steps that take to resolve those issues, especially when trying to address housing insecurity. You've been focused on policy development, on innovative solutions, on racial equity. So given what you've heard so far and what you know from your extensive history in the housing field, what reflections could you provide on some of the important tensions you see within the housing field and how this might guide our thinking?
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Abby. And you didn't need to provide my bio, because I'm going to actually do a little storytelling and take us back through a career that has been marked by a lot of tensions in the housing field. I've been working in the housing and community development field for almost 30 years now, dating myself. And here in this room, we actually have a lot of those fellow silo busters and bridge builders. And Professor Mitchell, you seem to have accumulated all of them on your amazing team here, so congratulations to you. But you know, my work I started doing community organizing and homeless activism and advocacy very young, in college and after college in the San Francisco Bay Area, where one of the tensions that continually rears its ugly head is between addressing homelessness and supporting economic development within a city. Later became, after grad school, went and worked at the Furman Center, NYU Furman Center in New York, during what was then known as the subprime crisis, before it became the national foreclosure crisis. David, I'm looking at you on this one, where one of the main tensions really was about expanding access to credit versus essentially foreclosures and mortgage market stability and neighborhood stability. Hopefully it'll become clear that I believe most of these are false tensions, and I'll, in this next example, make it really clear, because I then went over to the Urban Institute, where a big tension was, Megan, looking at you here, between fair housing and the affordable housing, and I would say the community development fields. And I remember starting at the Urban Institute, there's a woman scholar there, some of you may know Marge Turner, and I walked into Marge's office and I said, Marge, did you read this article in the New York Times by an author some of you may know, David Edsel, about where should a poor family live? I don't expect any of you will remember this article, but maybe that title alone kind of bristles, makes you a little nervous. It did me. It got worse. So Thomas Edsel said, you know, if a policy goal is to help families move up the ladder, where should a poor family live? Should federal dollars go toward affordable housing within high poverty neighborhoods? Or should subsidies be used to move residents of impoverished communities into more upscale and more resistant sections of cities and suburbs with better schools and opportunities? And he actually blamed the keeping people in poverty of what he called the poverty housing industry that conspires to keep poor families trapped in poverty by building affordable housing in distressed areas isolated from economic opportunities. And Marge had long championed a different approach, which she called a place-conscious approach, which recognizes that places have unequal access to opportunity, but that doesn't tell us how you fix that problem. And so we wrote my first blog post ever. This was in 2008, I guess. I think. I don't know, whenever blog post started. Whenever Urban's blog post started. And we wrote something called Disarming the Great Affordable Housing Debate. And we said this is really a false dichotomy. And we pointed out that if federal policy created both disinvested communities and it created barriers to moving into what we might call higher opportunity neighborhoods, don't we need policy solutions that do both, that don't stigmatize low-income neighborhoods, but don't let opportunity hoarders get away with it? So that really became a theme, like kind of challenging this dichotomous thinking has become a theme of my career, and I'll come back in a second. You haven't held up a sign yet, so I'm not done. About where I see some of the current dichotomies we need to be wary of. But I started to think about, well, how do we break this cycle? And you all may have dichotomous thinking of entrenched ideologies of sort of infighting, even if you claim to be out wanting to solve the same sets of problems. And let me just suggest, you all have ideas about this, but let me just suggest two. The first, which I think is so important, is we need to know our history. As I said earlier, if you looked at the current moment, as Tom Edsel did, and said, why are we trapping people in poverty? And you didn't actually go back and look at the history of credit redlining, of racial zoning, of eminent domain, as Rachel talked about, of heirs property, you would see how it was actually policy that created these separate and certainly unequal neighborhoods. So we need policy solutions, and we can't have ones that just say you need to move out, but we need to fix, improve, do better by neighborhoods that, I shouldn't say fix, but do better by neighborhoods that have suffered from disinvestment, protect neighborhoods that are going through economic transition and displacement pressures, and break down those barriers. So I'll just wrap up by saying, I didn't say what the second one was. So that's the first one. We need to know our history. The second, I think, is we, I think particularly as researchers, need to not get stuck on admiring the problem, right? We often are just, even as you're talking about history, and great books have been written about history, we need to look at solutions, and particularly solutions that do multiple things at once, what we might call both-and solutions, and actionable solutions. And I think that researchers often can admire the problem or come up with single solutions because they're disconnected from community experience. We've talked a little bit about that. Communities can't afford, that are most vulnerable to injustice, housing injustices, can't afford to admire the problem. They need solutions, they need fixes. And they often are the ones who don't see things in these dichotomous ways. They want to take care of their kids and their families and have the same opportunities that everybody else does. So I'll just end by saying, I think my last job, as you mentioned, because I went in reverse order, was before Lincoln, was leading the Office of Policy Development and Research at HUD. And two of the most dangerous dichotomies I see surfacing today is hitting rental protections against housing supply, or just generally whether or not we can continue to, whether it's just keeping homes affordable versus just building more. And particularly in the rental side. But I also think that this is where we're doing a lot more work at Lincoln these days, is between housing supply and the environment. And Alex mentioned rising insurance costs, as related to climate-related hazards and risks. But if you talk to a home builder, they will say we can't afford to build more resiliently. That's where we are right now. If we're passing the buck on to the future homeowner, the future renter, putting their lives and livelihoods at stake, paying exorbitant insurance costs, we're not doing it right. And it comes up in the public lands debate right now, that this administration is pushing for in a very different way we did in the Biden-Harris administration. it's pitting land conservationists against housing developers, right? Because what are we going to do with our public land? Are we going to protect it, or are we going to sell it off to build housing? So watch out for those dichotomies. Join the crew of silo busters, and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Solomon. So much in there. A quick plug. I think, Alex, you and I talked a little bit about this during the prep. The J.P. Morgan Chase Institute published a research that one of the key findings about the cost of home ownership is most homeowners knew what the cost was year over year, but because of the increases primarily driven by insurance, it's almost like it's almost like you have a variable rate every year. You're not going to understand what your cost is going to be like, and that's particularly important for the families we're all trying to serve. So Solomon, I think you were speaking to Senator Edwards Hart. I saw her nodding a lot. So Senator Edwards is a career advocate, activist, and voice on the behalf of the society's most vulnerable people. She was raised all over the world by her military mom, but chose to make East Boston her home. Prior to being elected to the Senate, she was part of the Boston City Council. She's worked extensively in the legal field, so she should feel right at home. She worked as a public interest attorney with the Greater Boston Legal Services, focusing on labor issues such as fighting for access to unemployment insurance, back wages, fair treatment of domestic workers. Senator Edwards coordinated a statewide campaign to pass the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights, and she won. Following the bill's passage, she was named a Bostonian of the Year. And she has been named to chair the Joint Housing Committee and led to the passage of the Affordable Homes Act, which I think is what Simone was referencing, which included policies like eviction record sealing, ADU as right for homeowners, and the creation of a fair housing office, and also included a $5.4 billion in bonds to address the Massachusetts housing crisis. So, Senator, here in Massachusetts, you've been a champion for expanded housing resources and a leading voice on fair housing measures. From your perspective as a policymaker, what are some of the main market forces you see impacting your constituents and working people in general? And what are principles and what concrete priorities do you think are especially important in taking action to address today's housing dynamics?
Well, first, thank you for having me, and apologies for missing some of the comments earlier. In terms of policy and in terms of what I'm seeing on the ground, I will take you back a little bit in my bio. What I did do for almost 10 years ago, I worked as the City of Boston's first director of the Office of Housing Stability, which was an office created by advocates, City Life, Rana, China's Progressive Association. These organizations came together and pushed the mayor to create the first Office of Housing Stability. And it's dedicated to, I got to set the mission, I got to set what we were going to do. And so I sat down and I said, okay, we're not going to be a services office, as in people come in, I need housing, we provide housing. That is repeating what's already being done by many a nonprofit. And so a lot of people try to turn the office into that, but we really pushed back. And we decided, one, we have to define what the problem is, not necessarily admire it, but define it. And so it was displacement. How are we dealing with displacement, and how are we defining it? And I said, so for bite-sized purposes, as a city office, we're not writing the academic big pieces. We're literally trying to solve displacement. So we defined it in 3 ways. So I said, we got to make it bite-sized. The first way in which people are being displaced, and I would say this still applies today, is through market forces. So you would call that the traditional understanding of gentrification. The second way in which we found people were being displaced in Boston, and I think in a lot of coastal cities or cities due to climate change, are emergencies. Fires. We had a huge amount of fires. We have old housing stock in this city. A lot of people during the winter time use a space heater. A lot of immigrants, a
lot of folks, working class folks, use their oven to heat themselves, and we were causing a lot of fires, flooding. All of these things are happening, and they displace. And then the final one was legal system, whether it's through evictions, through policy, but there's a whole way in which you displace people through those ways. And so this way, which is how we can attack. And how we had to attack it, we came up with pilot programs, and we came up with city policies, and we wrote state policy. The pilot programs literally were about giving money to landlords or setting up a program where we'd match landlords with young people if they were of different age groups, and we looked at all different things like that. So, excuse me. So in terms of what we're seeing today, I see a lot of the same issues in those three buckets still impacting people today. When we think about market forces, we think about just gentrification, but we forget a lot of that has to do with a sudden loss in income. The bounce back of the average American family is what, maybe 400? I don't know that even the majority of families can handle a $1,000 emergency, right? That's the statistics that we're talking about. So we are dealing with an economic as well as housing crisis when we're talking about the average American working class family. When it comes to emergencies, it's almost the same thing. Most people do not have first-class security and a broker's fee, which we are trying to get rid of, by the way. We have the legislation pending, hopefully it comes out of conference committee, and we don't ban broker's fees so much as say the person who contracted the broker should pay it, which is going to be overwhelmingly the landlord. Right now, the current down payment to rent is almost $12,000, right? And so we are trying to figure out ways in which we're dealing with those emergencies. But a lot of those emergencies, if it's dealing with these floods, and we've had rain, we're going to have rain, for the next 12 weeks, forever. And my basement floods. There are a lot of people who have basement apartments. That is a form of displacement. Or you will live there in decrepit conditions and get whatever diseases and conditions that come with that. And then when we were talking about the legal system, we were looking at, we did a displacement map that looked at we had a heat map based on the courts and neighborhoods that were facing the most evictions. So it turned red depending on how many people were being evicted. And we did this for all of Boston to see where folks were and who was getting displaced. And it was important to see that. We did this based off of court data, so we were able to update it almost on a regular basis. Defining and seeing those different things then helped us to create the policy that we can talk about later. For example, we just passed eviction record sealing. May 5th is when it became effective. We have 750 cases filed so far, but almost 200 cases sealed. We have 1 million to seal. That was before COVID. And so what I repeatedly see is, and what I'm concerned about is the tension that you alluded to recently, which is we push for production, and my colleagues are really pushing for production. And I've said it before, and I'll say it again, I don't believe in trickle-down housing. I don't believe you can build so many units that somehow they will flow down equitably amongst people, and then they will just be there. Housing is segmented, right? You build a bunch of single-family studio apartments, a huge amount of them, more than the market can bear. Studio apartments might get cheaper, but families still have no place to go and can't afford to get. So you have to see it that way. I also think that it's really important that when we're dealing with the production only, I wrote I think the first city's policy to incorporate affirmatively furthering fair housing in zoning. So we refuse to believe that you couldn't have fair housing and racial equity and protect people and also not have production. We actually made it part of your zoning policy. And developers, if you want to zone in Boston, you will have to incorporate integration and poor people and look at the neighborhoods around you and make sure that the project that you have is advancing equity. So you can build. So we want you to build, but this way. So it's really a balancing of a lot of different things, and when policymakers go too far one way, it is to the exclusion of a lot of people. I'll continue on. I see the stop sign. I'm a respectful politician, so I will.
Thank you, Senator. And that's actually one of the things that we are trying to balance as affordability and the lack of housing supply dominates the sort of the conversation around the U.S. is that preservation of current affordable housing, whether it's rental or homeownership, is crucial, because if you have a leaky bucket, if you're losing affordability, and you're never going to sort of build your way out of that. So thank you for your efforts in that. Let's turn a little bit more about the intersection of housing and heirs property. But I'm sure everybody here is interested in hearing more. Alex, heirs property owners may be especially susceptible to losing property in the face of speculators and investors' activity, especially given escalating housing costs and displacement pressures. What are some relevant trends that your data illuminates concerning investors' activity in the housing market?
So I think the most significant trend that we've seen, and we've been documenting the last couple of years, is the increase in investor activity in the housing market, really since the pandemic. So I think the low interest rate environment we experienced, plus the prospect of rising rents and rising home prices, brought in investors in a way that we've never quite seen before. And even as the home buying market has slowed down, investors still represent a higher share of transactions. So in the CoreLogic, now Cotality data that we have access to, investors comprised almost a third, 31% of single-family home sales. And that's up from 19% of home sales just before the pandemic. So investor activity has increased in the housing market. It's stayed at relatively higher levels. I do think there are some misconceptions about who these investors generally are, right? The vast majority of investors are and remain relatively small players, people who own a handful of properties. But you have also seen increases in activity among some of the largest players. So what we would most often call institutional investors, folks who own 1,000 properties or more. But overall, they still own a relatively small share, I think low single digits, of the overall single-family stock. However, these investors, of course, own a much larger share of the housing stock in certain markets, especially in the Sun Belt, especially in places with rapidly rising rents and growth prospects in terms of their population growth. But no matter what, it's important to note, I think these investors do have advantages in the home buying market over primary home buyers. They have the ability to pay in cash in a lot of cases. The ability to access lower cost financing, even where cash isn't necessarily needed in that case. They have the ability and scale to identify kind of lower value properties that just need significant rehabs to get up to market, and then the scale and ability to rehab that property and put in the maintenance at a lower cost and under a certain time frame. So these investors are more competitive. But one trend I think that's also notable and noteworthy that we report on in our forthcoming report is you've seen a shift in their acquisition strategies, especially among the largest players over the past couple of years. And it's more towards new build and acquiring new homes. So that means both working with existing builders who will build properties for them, so you don't have to deal with scatter site rental in the same kind of way. Or in some cases working with the subsidiary of the large institutional investor. So last year we saw a record high 94,000 single-family rental homes started. And that's up significantly from what we saw before the pandemic, where it was about 40,000, and then much lower for a long period of time before that.
Which doesn't help the pressures around access to homeownership, because as I've seen many presentations, the lack of starter homes on the single-family side is a huge issue and a huge pressure. Just a quick plug, I think there was an article this week around a partnership in Atlanta between the Housing Authority, nonprofits, and an institutional investor that bought some properties where they've created a first look program. So when some of the investors that gobbled all these properties are now interested in selling some of them, and they're creating partnerships with government and nonprofits to make sure that they have the first right to purchase. So it's an interesting model. I'll get you the link, Abby, so we can include it, because it seems like it might be able to be replicated in other places. Simone, turning back to you, access to effective financial literacy and counseling is a vital component of homeownership and has a lot of similar principles of what this group is trying to achieve in terms of heirs property and estate planning. Could you offer the audience some key lessons learned as why MAHA sees counseling as necessary? Talk a little bit about barriers your clients face and like how do you help them through that? And then of course take time to do a quick shout out of why your programs have been especially successful and what other resources you like to see.
Thank you, great question. So most financial education program assumes a baseline of financial stability and generational knowledge that most of our clients that we serve don't have. When you're working multiple jobs to make ends meet or dealing with immigration-related financial constraints or managing informal income sources, traditional budgeting advice does not account for these. Without generational wealth or financial knowledge, our clients are prime target for predatory lending. We also see families lose homes, equity stripping, get trapped in high-cost refinancing cycles where they use their homes as the bank, and fall victim to deed theft or some schemes that is especially common in our neighborhoods. Many of our clients have been excluded from mainstream financial systems. They bank with their cash in stores. They have thin credit file because they don't trust banks, and they grow up in a system where they've been failed or they've been disenfranchised or there's some trauma around banking that makes it harder and harder each day to walk into a bank. And then we talk about heirs property, right? We've worked with many families who have inherited property without clear title, often because their grandparents couldn't access estate planning services or don't trust the form of legal systems. And then also, from a cultural perspective, some of us just don't want to talk about dying. And so once you start talking about making a will, you're talking about dying, and we do not want to do that. So from a MAHA's perspective, our programs are successful because we root our counseling in cultural responsiveness. We have counselors who speak the client's languages, both literally and figuratively. And we work with, for instance, Asian families. We understand the cultural significance of group economics and informal lending cycles. For instance, they pool their money, and each week one person get all that funded. And it's not looked upon the same way in this country as it would in Jamaica or Haiti. With Latinx family, we recognize our extended family financial obligations often affect home buying decisions. So when you have to work to send money back home to family to help with grandma and grandpa versus buying a home, it's a hard decision. And so we have to think through those processes as we think about counseling. So we do not do one-jump workshops. Our typical client works with us for 12 to 18 months, and we offer the pre-counseling phase, which help with mortgage readiness, credit repair, savings and coaching, debt management, student loans, how to pack your lunch instead of walking into Dunkin' Donuts or Starbucks to get a cup of coffee and a donut. We also have our active home buying series where we connect again with the subject matter experts to get individuals to understand fully what the process is for owning your home, and the ongoing financial coaching with the foreclosure prevention process and the home maintenance education. So these are some of the reasons why MAHA has been so successful over the years, with over 50,000 individuals going through our classes in the 40 years since we've been in existence. So as we think about additional resources needed, we need more bilingual, bicultural counselors. We need HUD certified counselors who understand the different cultural experiences and can navigate complex family financial structures and can provide services in languages beyond English and Spanish. And we need individuals that look like us, that understand us, and can relate to what we are going through. Technology and digital literacy is one of the things that becomes clear during the COVID period, and so there's still a need for that out there. And there are two things that I want to talk a little bit about as we think about all that we've been experiencing. We have a systemic issue here, and we need systemic change to address these issues. And so we can't just sit around and think that things won't change because it's not impacting me or it's not impacting you. Ultimately, it's going to impact all of us because our children will move away if we cannot have access to the literacy and the funding and the homes that we need to make the change that is needed. And finally, the people that do the work are sometimes the people that also need the help. And as an executive director, I have to work every day to make sure that the people that are doing the work is not also in the same position. I might want to be counseling someone that also can't afford to buy a house, but I'm helping someone else to buy it. So we need funding in order to pay the people that's doing the work a living wage so that they can also own their homes while they're helping others to get into that home. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think that's the perfect segue, and you can see a theme around like the intentional policy decisions that were made that got us here, and how we need equally intentional policy decisions to sort of get us out of this affordability crisis, especially if taking account the externalities of those decisions. So, Senator Edward Solomon, we can all acknowledge that we're in an interesting area. Coming from DC, I'm happy to be here for the next 2 days. And the federal policy and the rapid changing and unpredictability is impacting the housing sector. At the same time, states and localities face increased pressure, less funding, and they have to find ways how they can continue to do the work that needs to be done while the sort of federal environment is a bit chaotic. So I would love to hear from you. What are some ways housing policy could be improved to better align resources provided by these different levels of government? Like, how do we get like the orchestra singing? If we think about the housing sector as an orchestra that can be beautiful when it's in sync. So yeah, who wants to go first?
Some ideas. So I'm also chair of the Housing for All Caucus, and so our job is to gather senators and state reps together to think about all the different things. And our next meeting will be about building recession-proof housing stock. And so there's several policies that we have pending or did pass and now need enforcement. The first big major pass that we did was changing the threshold for condo conversion protections. And so in 1983, we had condo conversion protections that are passed. They're amazing. If your apartment's becoming a condo, you get the following protections. Notice of a year or more. You get right of first refusal, so TOPA is in there, to purchase your apartment. You get move-out costs, and you also get an extended lease from 1 year minimum to however high. These are all minimums, by the way, and these are required state law, and cities can go higher than them. So the minimum lease that you will get is 1 year. In Boston's up to 5, and it's rent controlled. So that's 1983 law, passed. Then someone made very clear that it only applied to buildings that were 4 units and above, which for Boston and for a lot of areas in New England, that's a triple-decker is the working class family's home, triple and double-decker. So in the housing bond bill, I put the words owner-occupied in front of that exclusion. And so now, all of those protections now apply to 700,000 units of rental stock. So half of our rental stock now have these condo prevention or protection clauses. We just need enforcement. Most people don't know it. So now if a speculator's coming in and turning your apartment into a bunch of condos, you have right of first refusal, rent control, all of these different things. And so we don't have people necessarily on the ground to deal with that. Also passed It seems like a little thing, but it's a big deal that you can no longer forego a home inspection as part of the purchase of a home. Now, that seems like, so why is that? So real estate agents try to, they're not too happy about that. The housing inspectors, of course, very happy about that. But I was thinking that, no, actually, I don't know anybody who's, especially on a first-time homeowner program, especially who's on an FHA loan or a VA loan or any kind of loan or mortgage, that can purchase a home without a home inspection. You know who can? A speculator. They're going to put cash down, and they don't care what it looks like because they're tearing the damn thing down. So we passed that, and the regulations just came out June 15th. So again, slowing down aspects of which and how speculators enter into the market. I'll just also say again, the broker's fee is something we also are pending, but what we also passed, a lot of people don't know, is payments in lieu of a security deposit. So you can now, a landlord and a tenant can enter into an agreement that instead of paying a security deposit, so you can just pay first and last, but you will pay premiums on an insurance policy of like $30 a month on top of your rent. So that insurance policy, we are agreeing, as a landlord or tenant, will be to my benefit. You will never pay more than a whole month's rent for the whole year. You will never pay more than that. And regulations will come out from the AG to protect the tenant and make sure that the tenant wants this, but then you don't have to pay the security deposit. For me as a landlord, that security deposit is 1 month's rent. It won't cover the paint, oftentimes, even with a good tenant. So I'd rather have the insurance policy that covers my legal fees, that covers the paint job, that covers actual damages, and so on and so forth. So that's a policy that's in the housing bond bill. So is the home inspection, so are condo conversions. So a lot of it is getting people to know about these massive ways in which we protected, oftentimes around the edges, added to that the ADU as a right, so that people can now convert that. But this year we have to add in a bank because people don't have money for it. Because of those wonderful mortgages they have at 3.25%, people are not going to tap into their equity to build the ADU. Right? They're not. I'm not. I'm not touching that. So how did we need to unlock? So there's a lot of different ways in which we've been pushing, pulling, and policy. And of course, we have a lot more ideas to keep going. These are all state policies, by the way. Recession-proofing our housing stock is a response to Trump. This is all state level that we've done. We need a transfer fee to help raise money. We need it just like, and I'll just say this, I know I'm taking up, I'm sorry, but it works. Raising taxes works. I know I should say that as a politician. Don't put that on my campaign material. It does work. And I'll tell you how it works. We are now more resilient as a state simply because of the fact that we passed the Fair Share Tax Amendment, the Millionaire's Tax Amendment, okay? What that has resulted in is $1 billion more than the $1 billion that we expected. So we got $2 billion when we really only expected to raise $1. And it has to go to two things, education and transportation. We are able to, despite the Trump cuts, pay for and continue to pay for universal school meals for all of our children. So free meals for all of our public school children. We're going to be paying that, regardless of what the federal government does. We're also paying, we have free community college. We do. So we do that here in the state of Massachusetts, right? We have low-income fares for people to pay half of their commuter rail or half of their fees for public transportation. And we're able to still invest massively into the hundreds of millions of dollars and make the T solvent because we raise taxes. We raise taxes on millionaires. So that's, whether we like it or not, and that's what CPA does right now, Community Preservation Act, which is a tax that is a small tax on real estate taxes to help pull the money to pay for, and it's supposed to be matched by the state. So these are policies that are state and local, that raise the revenue, protect the housing stock, and make us more resilient. And that is literally my world right now because we have a divesting, if not hostile, federal government to housing people in the United States. Jump in.
Yeah, so I agree with everything you said, and I feel like I'm in the presence of a star I didn't know because until today, because I talked about the AFFH in zoning in Boston all the time during Trump 1. as well as the statewide AFFH in California, as well as Louisville did a racial equity review of their metropolitan zoning code, that's at Metro Louisville, as well as Chicago looking at fair housing and the LIHTC program. So all of this is to say, because fair housing I care very deeply about, is probably, no, it isn't probably, it is the first thing that is already gone.
Yeah.
In whole cloth from HUD. And I do think, state and local governments have to step in and fill the void, and it has to not just be in the usual suspect places. We need different narratives and different organizing and coalition building in different types of markets and political environments. But I also don't want us, during these challenging times, to forget the role that the federal government absolutely must play in supporting a functioning housing system in the United States. It's easy to do it because by necessity, states and localities are having to take on more and more responsibility. But the rhetoric that the government federal government simply needs to get out of the way to let the market work is one we're going to have to be constantly vigilant about countering. And that is true when it comes to privatizing the GSEs, removing the footprint of the FHA and VA and USDA in providing loans, the affordable loans to access homeownership for communities that have been shut out for too long, well-performing loans that actually generate revenue for the federal government. It's true when it comes to even land use and zoning, right? We have this idea that as long as the federal government didn't do anything and states and local governments just let the markets work, we'd be able to provide enough housing, affordable housing for everyone, and some of the other speakers have talked about that. I don't think that, I think the other thing I'm just kind of worried about is going back. Remember I started my story about doing homelessness work in the Bay Area. I think that this idea that we're going to solve homelessness through criminalization and through arrests and through sweeps, in creating greater rather than lesser barriers to shelter, when we know empirically rigorous randomized control trials have showed the best way to avoid recidivism into homelessness is to provide permanent supportive housing. The best way to prevent entrances into homelessness, because it's simple math, the way you solve homelessness is you prevent people from becoming homeless, and for people who are homeless and unsheltered, give them a home. And so the best way to do that is through tenant protections. And those are things that this administration is absolutely opposed to doing. The one thing I'll say, because I am at the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, is I do think that local governments have a lot of control over land use, land taxation, as you talked about, even increasingly efforts to be more innovative in the building codes to help bend the cost curve and make it more affordable to build, inclusionary housing policies. So I think, if I'll just stop, and I think we can't let the moment distract us from the fact that the federal government does have an absolutely crucial role. And even as we're playing defense, and state and local governments are doing the best they can with the tools at their disposal, keep on pointing throughout history that the role that the federal government has had, the positive role, as well as the negative role we talked about earlier, and then think differently about land and what isn't in your control, and the assets that you have and need to leverage.
Thank you. I think now we can turn to questions.
Hello. So I have a question. I'm really excited that, Alexander, you ended your presentation about how there is this silver lining about equity having increased. And I wanted to know, between the two institutes, is there any research being done on how we might anticipate, because of those rising equities, that taxation, that PITI, the taxes would also increase in future years when the general government do their reevaluations?
Taxes have already been increasing pretty considerably, right, across the country. So Yeah, I mean, that's happening. And that's a particular challenge, is why I called out the cost per rate and affordability challenges that lower income households experience in particular, right? So even folks who are, have this stable mortgage payment that isn't changing, increasing insurance costs, increasing property taxes are a greater burden for them, right? And like I said, that's true for lower income households, it's true for older adults on a fixed income that tend to be lower income. Yeah.
And one of I think that was one of the dimensions around the rising costs, right, is taxes and insurance. And I was part of a conversation earlier today around the challenges, especially for owners of heirs property, around accessing like the homestead exemption that allows for that. So we want to make sure we raise awareness to those programs that allow for some of that cost of
Senator Edwards, you're brilliant. I hope you go national. I can hear you speak all day long. But my question is, I'm for the Center for New York City Neighborhoods. We have a CDFI subsidiary, and we run all kinds of first-time homebuyer programs, home fix programs through that CDFI. We get a lot of our funding through Community Development Block Grant, CDBG, and all of that is written out of the budget. That's the 2026 budget. There was a continuing resolution that's going to extend that through September of 2025, but we're just looking to see what's going down the road, and it's really, really scary. And so all of this federal funding, plus like HUD is kind of getting cut 43%. So all this federal funding is going to stop. It's really going to affect all the programs that are going to go here in New York, and that's just going to happen in Massachusetts as well, everywhere. But I'm wondering, for Alexander, like, are you doing any studies or projecting how all of this is going to affect the housing market in 2026 and what that's going to mean? And also, when you have so much labor right now that's being brutalized and detained and deported into camps in foreign countries, and like that labor market's going to disappear. Like all these tariffs, all the imports for building materials are going to go away. So new housing, I can't imagine there's going to be much new housing stuff that's coming on. But like, I'm trying not to freak out about this stuff, but I'm just wondering what you're all thinking.
So we didn't talk at all today about the construction trends. You saw a modest uptick in construction last year, despite some of the affordability challenges. What home builders can do when rates are high are offer lower rate products to potential buyers in a way that existing sellers can't do. So home builders actually take advantage of some of the supply constraints to offer certain products to move housing. You've seen a slowdown in single family construction in the early part of this year. I think what you're seeing are the cost of construction, a lot of economic uncertainty kind of weighing on the housing market in a particular way. That's starting to slow things down. I don't know how long those cracks, of course, will last, and I don't make a lot of projections going out into the world, more than what I'm seeing in front of me, basically. We do talk a lot in this most recent report about housing demand projections that we have done as a center that came out earlier this year, and this is a silver lining in some ways, right? If you look at a big chunk of why we're in this era now, and it's a massive growth in housing demand and household growth that happened from 2020 to 2022 and 2023. That, for demographic reasons alone, will slow down. And it is going to slow down over the next 10 years. And right, the optimistic case I think you can make is that over the next 5-10 years, even if supply doesn't ramp up in some meaningful way, but if you stay steady, if you don't go back to the era of the last 15 years where construction was so low, but if you can keep things steady, that over time supply can catch up to this slower, demographically driven, lower demand.
Yeah. Well, first I just wanted to say, if I had a longer version of my bio, the Center for New York City Neighborhoods would have featured prominently in it, because when I was talking about resolving those tensions between mortgage access and preventing foreclosures and stabilizing neighborhoods, I think that the center is being one of the models, early models, and continued model on how to do that. So I feel like if we were on like a Zoom screen, I'd have star-eyed emojis over here, heart emojis going over there. But I did want to say that many cities, including New York City, are working with research institutions to project what the impact of those cuts are, and we're working with them. The Furman Center at New York I think they either just are about to put out their State of New York City's housing, which tracks all of the federal funding to New York. We're working on a project with the Urban Institute in the Bay Area that's doing the same. It's real. There's obviously a lot of uncertainty. So what we can say now is the role that federal dollars play in supporting robust local housing markets. It's harder to say what happens when those are gone. To your CDBG question, I will say the CDBG program and the home program, which were both, as you mentioned, zeroed out in the president's budget. States and localities will never let that fly, and their elected representatives. I don't think we should be complacent, but what I think is more likely to happen is a politicization of the block grant programs, whereas before they were based on an objective formula, a flawed but objective formula, that had winners and losers, but those winners and losers were not determined politically. My office did the formulas. I guarantee you, we never said, and anyone would ever say, don't give it to a red state. I think we're going to see a change. Whether that formula gets adjusted, somebody was like childbearing women or something. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? They're going to change block grant formulas based on the number of like fertile women or something. Do you get more Handmaid's Tale? And even if they don't change the formulas for fertile women, they will most likely put strings on the formulas and claw them back if you have DEI programs or you're using AFFH in your zoning formula. So look out not so much for a blanket cut, but for a politicization, I can't say that word today, but a politicization of block grant programs.
I think that's oh, sorry, go ahead.
Just 2 points. I mean, and you know, there's one thing that I can say for certain, as cruel as they are in their policy ideas, they are also stupid and ineffective in how they do that. Seriously. And that's one silver lining when it comes to this administration. They're not altogether that right. And what that means for those of us who are in this work and in this field is being able to navigate amongst those cruelty points. You have to be conscious about that and see that as the opportunity. Like there are times where I'm just like, you know, I represent East Boston. You know, I had ICE at elementary school drop-off, right? So there are times where I just have to remind myself there's no effing way that man is smarter than me, and with freaking idiots around him, I know I'm smarter, I am more resilient, my community is, and just reminding myself of my ancestors and the people who came, and we can do this. So there are times where, you know, the strength never came from federal dollars to begin with, okay? That's not what made us great. That's not what made my family succeed, and that's not what it is. That being said, I also have now been in politics long enough to know that federal, as much as the narrative is about, you know, federal dollars being handouts to poor people and so on and so forth, the amount of property owners and the amount of developers and the amount of speculators that depend on federal grants as well, that make so much money off of federal money. They are, you know, the bootstrap is a dream for just poor people. But seriously, the amount of federal contracts and money and grants, those CDBG grants, are necessary to line their pockets as well. So they're not going to go away. I agree that there's going to be a certain level of politicization, but at the same time, money talks, whatever the color of the state is. So there will be ways in which those grant monies will be flowing by virtue of the fact that his friends live all over the country, and they want to make money all over the country. And so sometimes, and it's really disgusting that you have to say this to civil servants, to public servants, to nonprofit leaders, and so on and so forth, who don't want to get into the dirty line of politics. But you will have to learn. You're going to have to learn how to navigate these stupid, bigoted people.
I just want to, Simone has to run, so I just want everybody to thank her for her time. If you need to go, you're welcome to. We don't want to make you wait, yes.
If we have 5 minutes to end, I'm fine.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Hi. I have a specific question for Mr. Herman, but first, my name is Mia, and I'm an undergraduate student also at the University of Michigan, so go blue. And I also am currently an intern for the Legal Services Center of Harvard Law School. And my question is first, like, I'm very new to housing policy, but I've heard about the potential new legislation on rent freezes or rent ceilings, especially in New York City, where there was a survey saying that 78% of residents will support this rent freeze or ceiling. And my question to you is, how do you think this will affect urban planning and the housing market, and do you think it will be a positive or negative effect for racial home ownership or to new or old tenants or investors? Thank you.
Rent control addressed to me, huh? Thank you for your question, and absolutely, go blue. I represent Harvard, I guess, but my heart is with the University of Michigan always. There's a lot that goes into rent control. I think, we could address this to everyone on this panel, really. Depending on how it's structured, I think forms of rent stabilization, rent control can make a lot of sense in the housing market. As a renter in the Boston market who has experienced pretty close to 20% in 1 year rent growth myself, like, I understand what rent gouging looks like and and how terrible that can feel, especially when it's unpredictable, especially when you don't know what's happening. I think you've seen an increasing number of states start to adopt forms of that. Oregon was kind of a leader here a few years ago, capping rent growth at, was it 10% plus inflation, basically. And I don't think you've seen, especially deleterious effects around housing construction and apartment construction in those markets. So something like that could be structured well and not have really negative consequences for housing development, because I think that's often the primary critique of those kinds of legislation. You've also seen kind of a growing number. I think San Francisco is a leader here, but a couple of other municipalities across the country taking aim at algorithmic pricing of rents. So there are a couple of property management companies who help set rent software, and they have, big presences in certain markets. Thinking about the effects of those for the housing ecosystem, especially in those markets where they're more prevalent, has been important. I'll be curious, I forget what the other municipality is, some of the effects of those that legislation there. So I don't know if other folks, I see some of them looking like he wants to say something about rent stabilization.
Well, I wrote a paper on this called "What does the evidence tell us about rent control?" So it still exists, but it's now about 8 years old, and there's lots of new evidence. But there are essentially 4 basic critiques of rent control. One is they will contract supply because developers, you won't want to build new housing. 2 is they actually reduce the existing supply because filtering, somebody mentioned before, people who are over-consuming housing are staying in their housing as their incomes go up and they don't really need it. 3 is it reduces the quality of housing because there's no incentive to improve. And 4th is that it's poorly targeted. So that people who benefit from rent control tend to actually be whiter and wealthier than renters who in the same city who don't get rent control. And what I can say is we looked at all 4 of those evidence dimensions, and it's mixed evidence across all 4 of them. I would have said, if you asked me a year or 2 ago, that the last one is the worst one, the one where there's the most evidence to suggest rent control is really, really poorly targeted. But a paper came out just actually a couple months ago from the Urban Institute, which I don't know, I haven't fully read it, but says the opposite, that rent control is actually reaching the people who need it the most. So no easy answers. just from the research side. There's no consensus on this, but it is definitely the third rail when it comes to, like, this is what will get the American Apartment Association, get everybody and their cousin up in arms.
Do we have time? Where's the mic? Oh, we don't have time. Oh, 2 minutes? We're getting to One more. I think on this side, there's,
On that side of the room.
yeah, there's been some hand raising on this side.
Appreciate it, guys. Yeah, you guys have been doing a heck of a job. You guys are fighting a good fight. It's exhausting work. And, you know, I'm sure we're all proud of you for real, because I sure am. And so keep doing the great work you're doing. My name is Matt Lawrence, and just all the talk around, all your efforts around housing, you know, my father and I, we're farmers, right? And so when it comes to growing up and seeing marginalized people and disadvantaged folks in the rural areas as well as the urban areas, we see the positive effects, right, of helping these areas. But what we were seeing, the lack of, obviously, proper nutrition. Is there a way that you guys are, I guess, mending nutrition or something like that when it comes to housing? Does that make sense? And being able to, when you talked about Senator passing the bill to have every kid have free lunch, right? And so not just children but families. And so that's something that we do in Hartford, Connecticut. So we have a farm in Georgia. We have 300 acres, and not only a farmer, I'm a former NFL athlete, retired, I'm in full global philanthropy, but I want to help urban areas and rural areas, and people get better, proper nutrition so that they can live and thrive and be educated. So we have produce, and we bring it to Hartford, Connecticut, in the Northeast to make sure communities can eat. So is there any work surrounding that? You know, because just myself and other farmers would love to help feed you know, the folks who need the most.
I would say I don't think anyone would disagree that housing and health, or housing and access to that has everything to do with health outcomes. There is a movement, though, and there's often talk about food deserts, and that has a lot to do with the zoning and where people are able to afford housing. Where you're able to afford housing determines the quality of food that you have access to, and oftentimes the education you have access to. And so what we learned, and I will say this, what COVID taught us is that if you build it and feed people en masse for free, you can do it. I mean, that's literally what the results of our universal school meals are, because Massachusetts had to hold a mirror up, like, we fed these kids for free and just handed it out with no questions of their income, with no application for JACA, and we just fed them. And so that is, it forced us to have that system and move in a way. And we've been, at least the city of Boston and Mayor Rose, under her leadership, I think she contracted with City Fresh Foods, which is a black-owned, gave the largest city contract to a black-owned business, which is City Fresh Foods, which provides school lunch. And we have universal school lunches. So we do see that as part of our housing policy. Where those houses go, and oftentimes the mixed-use economic development, whether you're putting a local grocery store on the first floor and then having housing above it, and making sure that displacement conversation does include small businesses, including barbershops, the grocery stores, and the bodegas, and all these other components as well. It's housing makes the neighborhood, right? We're building affordable neighborhoods and futures. That's the point, too, of what we're building.
Yeah, there's a lot of interest around critical amenities like food and the connectivity, so thank you for that. Alex, what you gonna?
One thing I want to say, not about nutrition specifically, but I think I had remarks early on where I said the pandemic reset the housing market in really important and fundamental ways. And one of the ways that it did that I didn't say is that we used to associate affordability challenges with coastal cities specifically. But the pandemic and what's happened since has meant those affordability challenges have reached everywhere in the country, and including in rural areas. In some ways, in places that we have never had those affordability challenges before. Home prices increased more in rural areas than they did anywhere else in the country during the pandemic. So, yeah.
Well, thank you, everyone. We really appreciate your attention.
Okay, this is a major success. We're only 8 minutes over, and I'm responsible for about 4 of them, so we'll be even better tomorrow, but this is great. What a wonderful panel, just incredibly interesting, smart perspectives, and kudos to everyone for that great panel and roundtable. So at this point, we're going to break for our reception. It's literally just down this hall, just walk down this hall, and then go out the doors, and then there's a house called Barrett House, and that's where the reception will be. And we'll down the stairs to the left, you'll see the house. And so I look forward to having everybody have time to meet each other in a more informal setting. So I think we're just off to a great start. Thank you.